Welcome to Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. Once a month, because of the great support we get over on our Patreon page, which you can go and also support to if you go to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Over there, because of the wonderful support we get to do these once a month bonus episodes that we call Sondheim Adjacent, where we normally talk about things that are sort of tangentially in regards to Stephen Sondheim, something he may have brushed against and helped flourished, or someone who was in one of his projects who went off and did their own thing. This month, it's not so much Sondheim Adjacent as Sondheim Overlapping. We're going to be talking about an article from a recent book that was published. And so, Micah Mooney, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Happy to be here. Yeah.
Now, I know what's going to happen out there. People have looked at the episode title and they've realized that this is a new person that's coming on the show here, and their arms are folding and they're rolling their eyes and they're like, a new guest? How dare we? So I guess my first question is, explain yourself. Who are you?
Oh, explain myself. Okay. So I'm Micah. I am currently a student at the University of Michigan. I am working on my PhD in music theory. I am, really into musicals, Sondheim, and have slowly in my academic career been allowed to, and just like bringing in musical theater studies into my term papers and stuff. And so that's a little bit about me, I guess.
Well, here's the thing. When did you realize that you were just like a nerd for music?
Oh, okay. So this is the story. When I was younger, my parents had us do piano. They didn't let us quit piano until after high school. So in elementary school and middle school, I did piano, hated piano, and I asked to quit basically every week. Then I started composing and just got back into music, and then had a complete 180. Middle school years were rough, but then I was like, you know what, actually, I think music's pretty cool. And so I just started and then kept going.
I feel like you're bypassing a large section of your story here, because you just said, like, I just started composing, but like, what made you think, like, I'm going to write a song?
When I was in middle school, I had to play all these pieces that I was told to play, and they were nice and all, but there was something that's just like, well, I want to do this. I want to play this. And so it just started so we would actually, our piano studio would have a required composition recital. So all of the students in the studio would do a composition. Now, as the older students, they tended to not do it. So it's mostly the younger kids it was required for. But then I really enjoyed that. And then I started doing compositions even outside of the ones required for the studio. My mom was like, oh, he's at the piano and I'm not forcing him to be at the piano. I'll just let him keep doing whatever he's doing. And so, yeah.
Was it musical theater, though, that you were inspired by even then, or did that come later?
It was a little later. I think my first attempts at musical theater-y stuff was in high school, a little bit later. In college was when I really I had some more serious attempts, and then the most serious attempt actually culminated in a musical which was co-written with my friend Noah Gould, and we ended up having that premiered and all, and that was,
what was that
living
called?
The dream. Yeah. Say that again. Oh, it's called Antigone and the King.
Oh, okay. Based off of like the Greek
tragedy,
play.
Antigone. Yeah, exactly. So yeah.
I was an English major, so I read those Greek plays.
All of them.
Okay, well, that's exciting. So then, I mean, you go to college. What makes you then go like, I need to even go deeper than this and do a master's and now ultimately a PhD?
Yeah, I think part of it is just career goals. Like, I really loved my professors, and I had great experience in school, and just loved the idea of teaching and being a professor, and then in master's doing research, really loving that and just digging in deep to analysis and coming up with ideas and sharing them and having dialogue. And so the idea of teaching and communicating that information to students, because the reality is I'm not a great performer. Like, I don't love performing. That's another reason why I got into theory and composition. I say I like to write music and I like to write about music. And so I can do piano, for the classroom and whatnot and all. So, but I don't love performing, but I love music and thinking about and talking about and writing it. So if I can pass on these ideas that can inform a really excellent performer to then heighten their experience. That's what I really would love to do. So even with my research, I've talked about that in some of my papers about, like, I'm hoping that this analysis can help inform. It's not just for other scholars of musical theater to read about, and we all, talk together in our dungeons and scheme about musical theater, music theory, but it's something that then can be accessible and informing performances as well.
I will say the musical dungeons are my favorite of all the dungeons I've been to. I mean, I would assume you're too young for this. I mean, I'm too young for this. Have you gone back and watched any of Leonard Bernstein's teaching on television to young people?
They're incredible. They're really incredible. He was like one of the first scholars, composers, professionals who really wanted to, at least in American music theory, really wanting to make it accessible to a public audience. Just like, if you like going to the concert hall, what should you be listening to, and how can we make that appropriate for that audience? So
it feels to me like there is such a loss, because when you watch some of those videos, which there's a lot of them on YouTube, people can track them down. Yeah, he was able to take sometimes like really advanced concepts, but really speak to it in a way that young people or even just lay people would be able to understand and pick up on, like, oh, okay, now I kind of understand how this all works. In the, whatever it's now been, like 60 plus years since those kind of specials stopped, it doesn't seem like there's been anyone who kind of came and picked up that baton and ran with it. I'm sure there is like the occasional YouTube video out there that can break down a concept, but there doesn't seem to be this sustained like ambassador of music that comes out that allows people, I think, to think, oh, I can understand this stuff without having to go and get an advanced degree, if you know what I mean. Like, it seems like some of these concepts are perceived to be something that you have to be like study for like years and years to even understand. And I don't know if that's necessarily true, but I think that's what the concept is for a lot of people.
Yeah, I definitely get the sense our field really, really wants to break down that like idea that you have to have a degree in order to do music theory. Like at our most recent conference, there was a whole session, like the plenary was about public music theory. And the idea is that, you can go online and there's music theory, and you can do this at home, and you can do it if you're in college, you can take a class for non-majors and still learn a lot of how do you approach music and think about music in an interesting way. And I think kind of maybe what like carried that baton might be like some YouTube channels there's a lot of really great ones that break down concepts, and we don't necessarily have the same Bernstein figure who's like the conductor of a major orchestra who's also then doing these like symposia, but I feel like it's still carried on in some way.
We just need to have some hot young composer come out here and teach us music. That's really what I'm asking for. Micah, you are here on this kind of like bonus episode, this Sondheim adjacent episode, to discuss this recent book that was released that is free to the public to go and actually download. You can do it off of their website. The link to that will be in the show notes here. But the book collection is Here for the Hearing. So here as in HERE, Here for the Hearing, HEAR. So Here for the Hearing, a collection of essays specific about musical theater, correct? Like that's what the whole book is like focused on?
Yeah, subtitle, Analyzing the Music in Musical Theater.
And in particular, we are going to be discussing chapter 2, which is entitled Sondheim's Dissonant Tonality, that was written by Drew, is it Nobile or Nobile?
Nobile.
Drew Nobile. I will also say that chapter 1 is written by like two-time guest on this show, Nathan Barry Bluestein. So he's been on this show a couple times.
Yeah. So the book, shout out Michael Buckler and Gregory J. Decker, the editors of it, and they gathered some great people in the field just to write these articles to kind of showcase this is basically the first published volume that takes a very serious analytical music theory approach at the repertoire of musical theater in one volume from very different, just, this collection. So it's been kind of a little bit groundbreaking in our field that I was so excited to get my hands on it, and have been working my way through it. And some of these articles have already appeared, and I just gave a conference presentation last month that I was citing two of them decently heavily. So I think and I keep hearing that a lot of these articles are getting cited in more work.
Not to like create a schism here, why has there been this reticence to, I guess, study musical theater more deeply than what it has been in music departments?
Yeah, that's a good question that I can maybe scratch the surface of. But
and I need names. You need to call people out.
No, so the reality is like music theory as an academic discipline in the United States is pretty recent. You know, last 50. Society for Music Theory, our main like academic organization, has been around for less than 50 years. And the first PhDs in theory were given in the late 60s, something like that. So the earlier years of our field were really focused on two types of music theory, primarily. Schenkerian theory, which basically was your toolbox for looking at tonal music that is in keys. So if I say it's in C major, that's, key of C, tonality, right? And then you have 12-tone music or post-tonal music, that's more broad, I guess, better. Scholars like Alan Fort talking about, 12-tone or set theory. How do you analyze that kind of music? Where you wouldn't say, oh, it's in D major or G major. There is no key signature. There is lacking that sense of tonality. So that was where the field was for a really long time. And then slowly things have kept adding in. And so a lot of the research on musical theater in like music academia tends to be more on the musicological side, maybe looking at the history of it or the social implications, but just slowly over time, taking a look at the theoretical or analytical aspects of basically most popular genres. It's just a little bit later in coming to the field since it's a newer field to begin with.
Okay. That does make sense. I know that academia sometimes moves a little slower.
Sure.
Based off of like, this is the way we've always done things sort of thing. So maybe you can just do a very broad overview of what this chapter is about. And then I think, we can start moving our way a bit sequentially through this. We're not going to get into like the actual like nitty gritty of the examples that are written about. I think that's best left up to the reader to kind of go in and parse out a little bit. But I do like some of the ideas that are brought up within this article that I think deserve a broader conversation. But why don't we start off by just saying like, what is this actual chapter about?
Perfect. So after reading this chapter, I just thought this is so cool and wonderful. Thank you, Drew Nobile, for doing this research, publishing it. Thank you, Michael and Gregory, for publishing it as well in the edition. Basically, the idea is that a lot of music analytical studies, music theory studies on Sondheim, which there have been a handful, but almost all of them tend to focus on leitmotif, like Wagnerian motif, which we talked about. Like the bean theme in Into the Woods, or Dies Irae being used in Sweeney Todd. These ideas of taking a small little musical material and turning it into things, and it having association. So that's like one of the big things for music theory research on Sondheim. And then the other one would be his use of pastiche and the way he can mimic previous styles or other composers. So that tends to be where the studies in analytical writing have stopped. And Nobile says basically there's a lot more too. Like, yes, it makes sense. We should totally talk about those things because it's amazing, and Sondheim is awesome when it comes to motif and pastiche. But Sondheim himself would say that harmony is everything, and that harmony is the base, is the most important thing to him as a composer. I think Sondheim says it's the most important thing to music, and I think that's a little of a red flag because I think that's a very Western music kind of association, very right? Much, rhythm and melody are really key aspects in other kinds of music around the world. But I think he has a good point in saying historically in Western music, classical and popular, like harmony is really important. Definitely in classical. But so the idea behind this chapter is let's look at Sondheim's harmony. And when people talk about his harmony, they tend to say things like, oh, it's dissonant, or maybe it's crunchy. But like, what does that actually mean? Are there trends? What's the similarity between Sondheim's sound of dissonance versus just any kind of dissonant sound or clashiness? And so this article aims to break down what those trends are and what those consistencies are. and I think very successfully.
So yeah, we'll get into kind of how it's analyzed and broken out into the classic, I guess, Sondheim sound of what is actually happening within the music. Before we get there, there is an introduction in this article, and I have highlighted some things in this PDF copy that I'm currently looking at. And the first thing is this. This is because of my, surface level knowledge of the different composers in like the Western history of music. But I want you to explain this line, because he writes, in particular, Sondheim's compositional framework allows striking dissonance to pervade the harmonic layer without obscuring listeners' sense of key. As the composer himself puts it, they don't feel Schoenberged into anything. But I don't know what that means.
Yeah, so Schoenberg is was a composer in the 19th and 20th centuries, and who pioneered the 12-tone method. In what he was the leader of what was called the Second Viennese School of Composers around 1910s, 20s. He was active decently far into the 20th century, but his idea was, what if, instead of the idea of do we need our dissonances to resolve? So we're so used to, and we want to hear that resolution, right? But what if that note didn't need to go up to that note? What if we just let dissonances be dissonant? And so the idea was releasing dissonance so that it didn't have to obey the rules of tonality. So the whole idea behind Schoenberg was that we could release the notes, the dissonances, from the sense of the key, and so that they didn't need to necessarily go somewhere. But that meant we didn't necessarily feel like we started somewhere or ended somewhere. And he would use that through motif and through other things, maybe some pitch centers here and there. But the idea behind not necessarily needing to be Schoenberg into anything would be that we can still maintain a sense of a key. We can still have tonality. We can still have a home, what music theorists would call tonic, our one chord. So if we're in the key of C major, it's a C major chord. That's our tonic, our one. So we can still have a sense of that being home and rest and where we want to end on and come back to. But we can still experiment with all of these other dissonants above. I'm just hitting random notes.
What is argued, and this is not like a secret really, because we've even discussed it on the show before, about how very often throughout Sondheim shows in particular, we have a general theme, or I'll just call it like a melody of some kind that sometimes it forms the base of, I guess, every musical idea that gets brought up. And sometimes like something that's brought up in one song doesn't get resolved until like 3 or 4 songs later, but it feels such like a part of a piece. I think that's part of the reason why I love Sondheim. I love the classical music, or not classical music, a lot of the like golden age of Broadway stuff, is because the whole show feels like it's part of a piece.
There's 2 analyses at the end of the chapter that do a deep dive into Sunday in the Park with George and Into the Woods. And I think they do a really great job of showing that kind of consistency across the show and like the tension and resolution that we get. And
it's such a cool way because, I wish I had read this article before I recorded the last couple of episodes in the Into the Woods season, because it really knocks it down, like how those final 3 songs really build on each other and actually call back to the prologue very specifically. There's actually resolutions that are happening in those songs that were set up in Act 1 that are not getting paid off until Act 2. And again, I think intuitively I understand that and I can feel that, but here's like the evidence. Like this is actually how it's going on, and this is what he's doing in the music to achieve that.
Yeah. So listeners, check it out.
Yeah, go and read something. The really cool thing about this article is that he breaks it down that you can think of Sondheim's music in terms of these 3 compositional zones. So we have the bass zone, the chordal zone, and the melodic zone. But you, Micah, will probably have a better handle of explaining what those 3 are and how they interact with one another.
Yeah, sure. So Nobile here, borrowing some ideas and terminology from Daniel Harrison, who's another scholar, and just that was work on contemporaries of Sondheim and other composers in art music and concert music traditions, classical music of the mid and up to the late 20th century, which got kind of back to tonal music. So you had Schoenberg and you had the atonal stuff, and then you get kind of a reaction. You're getting more tonality, but it's dissonant. And so the idea that what Sondheim is doing here is not unique, but it's actually in line with this tradition of some of these contemporaries in the art music realm. So that's something I think that's important to say, where these ideas. But yeah, so Nobile talks about 3 zones. We've got our bass, our chordal, and melodic. So the bass zone, and you can think of these just like visualizing on a piano, or maybe better would be if you're looking at a full score of the musical, right? So you have the bass, which is literally the bass, and it's usually just moving pretty solidly back and forth, or maybe stepwise, or pretty simple stuff. Yeah, we've got like in Into the Woods. So it's a very simple, it's usually the notes of the main harmonies that we're used to. So our tonic, our home that I talked about, dominant, which is the main one in tension with the tonic that goes back and forth, which is, if you're counting, or it's the 5th scale degree. If you're familiar with solfege, that's sol. And then there's also, you might get predominant things that happen before you get to the dominant, that delays the tension of the dominant and before eventually getting back to tonic. So they tend to be really simple. They tend to be focusing just on scale degrees 1, 4, and 5. And maybe I can play some examples, but let me go through the other zones. So we have the chordal zone.
Well, before we get to the other zones, just like, I guess, tie that up into a little bit of a bow, because he does go through each of these zones then sequentially and writes a little bit about them. But because I think Sondheim is often thought of as like, oh, he writes these very complex lyrics, and then he really focuses on like atonality, which is, it's not wrong, but he writes here on, what is this, page 39, inside the bass zone section, he says, it is in fact that the simplicity of the bass is what allows him to incorporate so much dissonance, because it is that rock, that foundation of everything building on top of it.
Yeah. You summed that up so well. I think, while we're still here, I think also in this section they talk about root representatives. So basically the idea is that it doesn't matter what's above. If we're in the key of C major and we have a C on the bottom, we're going to get that sense of tonality and home, even if we have all these dissonances above. What really matters, the root of the chord, which is the one that it's built on. If you have a chord, you build it on thirds above the root. And so that's how we know, if you build a chord on top of, thirds on top of the tonic, you have tonic chord, and that's what it means by the root. So if you have, let me do an example while we're here. In Being Alive, this is one of the examples from the book. You've got these. And then some dissonances here. Like that's crunchy, but we still have that same note there. It's still gonna be home. And then eventually now we jump down to here, and we're changing the basses. And so now, what's in the bass? We have the 5. Even though on top we don't necessarily have that, it clashes. It's not as dissonant as some of the other chords, but eventually we'll get back to our 1. So the idea that really whatever is the bottom note of the bass determines the chord, the function of the harmony.
That's awesome. Okay, so then yes, let's get into then the chordal zone. What does this mean?
The chordal zone. So what I was playing in that company example, we had the bass. Everything else I was playing in the right hand was the chordal zone. So the idea being that if we have a really solid bass that works alongside the melody, that the melody what the characters are singing, if they go along with what the chords implied by the bass note are, then we can get all this other stuff in the chordal zone, in the accompaniment patterns in the right hand of the piano. And it doesn't matter if it clashes with the melody. It doesn't matter if it clashes with the bass line. It can kind of do its own thing. And if it's a little bit more flexible, Nobile says, for doing like matching the dramatic purposes. So if it's a very peaceful thing, you might have more sonorities, like soft things like that. But as we'll talk about later, you might get some more dissonant if it's a crunchy thing, if it, depending on what the dramatic purposes are, that might affect this chordal zone. But it doesn't really matter the notes in the chordal zone because the harmony is so reliant on the bass and in the melody that it can conflict, and we're not going to lose our sense of home and where the tonic is.
You can tell me if this is too much of a digression, but one of the other things that I highlighted here is him making this distinction between tonic chords and dominant chords. I don't know really, or I don't really understand the difference, because he writes about how, like tonic chords, dominant chords rarely appear in pure triadic form outside of Sondheim's pastiche numbers. Now, we don't have to break down that sentence too much, but I just want to kind of more understand what is meant by a tonic chord versus what a dominant chord is.
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've thrown around a couple terms. I think one that I threw around a little willy-nilly that I will now take the time to explain a little bit more detail is function, which is very important.
Save your letters, everyone.
Yeah, function. There we go. So harmonic function basically is within, remember when I played our scale?
Yeah.
And this note wants to go there. It functions as not the end. It functions as the tension leading to the resolution. So when I talk about harmonic function, the idea is that certain chords and certain harmonies function in a different way. So in the same way you might get this pop progression. You have a progression. One chord goes to another chord. That's a very similar idea of a function when we talk about harmonic function. So our tonic function, tonic, that's the same word I've been using for home, for stability, for the one chord. Tonic is all of those things. It's home. It functions as our stability. And dominant is anything that functions that leads to the tonic, right? So that is often a 5 chord. Because we wouldn't want to end there. No, we want that resolution. So it functions as tension, and it builds and builds and builds. And it often is a 5 chord, but you can have other dominants or dominant function like things. You could have the 7 chord. So when Nobile is talking about how Sondheim's tonic is still going to have the function of tonic, which is home and stability, but it's not usually a 1 chord triad, a C major in the key of C. It's usually going to be decorated. This is scale degrees 1, 2, 3, and 5. We have more than just the 3 notes, but it's our home, it's our stability. This note is not it doesn't need to resolve somewhere. We can end a song there and we're totally fine. Mozart would not end a song there. we need that full, just a 1 chord stability. That's the tonic in other styles, but Sondheim, Nobile says in Company, basically it's always this, a 5-note chord with 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 all are like necessary to be a fully filled out tonic sound, tonic chord. But we can end there. So the opposite then is the dominant function. So dominant function is what leads to that, right? So usually in Mozart and Beethoven we have 5 to 1, but Sondheim's dominant is a little bit more decorated, and it tends to be something like this, or where we have or maybe, but we have scales degree 5, something like that. So I'm playing a G, C, D, A. So it's crunchy. Usually it'd be, we had a B, that T, do. But Sondheim doesn't necessarily need to have that tension of that.
I know it's written about a little bit later in the article, but is that in part why, even though like if you listened to Company versus A Little Night Music versus Sweeney Todd versus Sunny in the Park with George, all those scores sound vastly different from one another, and yet intuitively we know, oh, this feels like a Sondheim piece here right now, even though the songs themselves may not actually sound alike.
Yeah, 100%. I'd agree. One of the things that I was thinking about, and I've been thinking about this just in some of my other work as well, is like when you try to nail down and talk about like a composer's style, what does that mean? And a kind of funny definition of that I've kind of come up with is like, oh, if you were to mimic the composer, like do a parody of that composer, what are the things that you would do in order to make that sound like and have that joke land as as a parody? So yeah, if you wanted to parody Sondheim, like that's kind of the things you would do there, and some certain chords, which is later in the article, that he tends to use a lot in all of his shows. Those are the kinds of things that you might pick up on as a listener. You'd hear those and recognize, oh, that sounds like a lot of other Sondheim stuff, even if you're not entirely sure exactly what you're listening to. Yeah.
So we move on to, well, the next section is the colored chords and the 0148 set. So I don't know if you want to explain what that means.
Yes, wonderful. So as we were just talking about, there are certain chords that Sondheim likes to use a lot. And this builds off of Harrison's scholarship on other 20th century composers, tonal composers as well. This idea of the quote unquote colored triad in a similar sense of what we were just talking about, like, oh, we have our one chord. It's not just the three notes, C, E, G. We'll have some other notes thrown in there that are kind of, we'll say they are stable still, even though they're added on. The idea of a colored chord is maybe less of the function and just the idea of like, oh, the presence of a chord, where we'll add in a dissonant note to it to add color, to add that, spikiness if we need that. But it's going to still, it won't necessarily change the fact that it functions in as a dominant chord or dominant function or tonic function. This is a really cool section because he notes that there are two chords that Sondheim has, and there are quotes of Sondheim talking about like really liking these. And so, for example, one would be you have a major triad with a added minor sixth on top of it, above the root. So that's our major triad. Here's our minor sixth. When we play them together, we get, and it might be different notes on bottom. We call that inversion. Might be voiced differently, but he tends to like having those four pitches where you have, three of the notes. It's a major triad, and then another one you have just a half step above that last highest note, right? Another very common one that he likes to use is a minor chord with a major seventh on top. So that's our major seventh, minor chord when we play them together. I can't play that without hearing the witch.
I was going to say, it's like the witch coming into to meet us here. The third guest, everyone, the witch.
Yes. Exactly. So what is very interesting about these two chords, though, is that they're related in a very special way that music theorists might geek out over, and I'll do my best to explain. So the title of this section is called the 0148 set. So let me explain what that means. This actually comes from Schoenberg's ideas of the 12-tone method. So when he would do this, he would make sure, like, his general technique is basically, I'm going to have each note of the 12 chromatic pitches of a scale on the keyboard, and I'm not going to repeat one until I repeat all of them. So they all kind of are equal. You don't get a sense that one is stronger and they're longer. There's exceptions. He'll have pitch centers here and there, but that's the general gist of a 12-tone composition. And so based on that, like, if you're dealing with music like this, music theory kind of has developed this idea called like set theory, where it comes from the mathematic, set theory. It's similar ideas, but the general idea is that we can look at relationships between notes in non-tonal, post-tonal relationships and see if there's patterns that we might find. And so for notation simplicity, since we're dealing with all of the notes all the time, it'd be really annoying if we had to be like, oh, F sharp and F and G sharp and G natural and all these things. So the quickest thing is we'll just say, okay, we're gonna call them numbers. So you have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and then we have T and E for 10 and 11, right? For B flat and B natural. And so when we look at these sets, 0148 is basically telling us information about the intervals. So if we start with C, which is O, 0, And we just count up 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. We have a C sharp, an E, and a G sharp or an A flat. And so that's the minor chord with a major 7th on top. I just took the C and I put it on top. So It doesn't matter what note's on the bottom. It's going to be considered an 0-1-4-8 because that's the tightest, smallest we can consider. But now here's the cool part. All right, so let's start with the C again, but I'm going to put it up here. Let's count down. We're going to turn that chord upside down, right? So instead of going up 1/2 step, we'll go down 1/2 step, and I'll just start counting down. So I'm saying numbers that are not actually associated with the notes, but for the sake of showing us flipping it down, let's do that. So we have the 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. What's that? Now we have a major chord with a minor 6th on top. So the two chords that Sondheim really liked to use are very similar. They both contain an augmented triad, which means we have two major thirds stacked on top of each other. And then we have a minor second away from one of those members. So it changes based on which inversion we're in or kind of what note's on top. But they're very related sonorities that Sondheim tended to be gravitating towards. So I thought that was really fascinating, really interesting, and opened my eyes to a lot of like what we hear as like Sondheim style and sound. You know?
Yeah, like you can definitely hear it as you're giving those examples. I guess for the lay person, or if the person who's listening out there is like, yeah, cool, but so what? I guess that's my question to you is like, what does that actually, I guess, reveal about him as a composer? Like, how does he, I guess, use those? How does he use that within his music that, puts him above other composers, in his peer group?
Ooh, that's a good question. I think like, I don't think the idea is that Sondheim was necessarily aware of like, oh yes, I will take this chord and turn it upside down. Like we do know that he did that with melodies, and so he's very common with the idea of inversion. But I think what that speaks to is just like honestly his personal preference towards certain dissonances. I think that the fact that he so consistently wrote very similar chords is just shows a lot. Like there's other composers that really like certain chords that they come up a lot with. So like Stravinsky used what's called like the octatonic set, and Bartók was a really big fan of like whole tone collections and then chromatic collect and certain sonorities and sounds that composers were just generally like would prefer to perform and play. So I think I wouldn't say it necessarily like the fact that these two chords that he preferred are inversionally symmetrical, like that doesn't make him any better of a composer. I think what's just more interesting is the fact that it's almost proof that he had a very attuned ear and very consistent preferences, even in different contexts, because one of those chords is based on a major chord and another is based on a minor. So it's like the same idea, the same general dissonance, but based on its context, he could use either one. Yeah, I hope I answered that question.
No, it is. I had to look up something here on my phone, but it's like what it reminded me of here as you were explaining that is authors, like if you get a favorite author out there, the more books or short stories that you read from them, you'll very soon discover like, oh, they really like to use this word a lot, or like a phrase. And I was like, so like Agatha Christie, just for instance, loves saying dark black coffee, that exact word. Like all of her characters are dark black coffee, and so many of her characters wear pince-nez glasses, like in the same way that Stephen King, like every single one of his characters smokes Pall Mall cigarettes. Like it's just a thing that he puts in there. It's just a thing they go back to. Whether they know that they're doing that or not, I guess, is the question. But I think that's this is one of those things. It's like I'm an author and I use this word quite a bit because it's just a word that pops into my head that I like to use.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful observation.
So thank you for doing that. Then we get into the analysis, which he goes into I Love Sunday in the Park with George and Into the Woods in great detail and explain kind of what Sondheim is doing into that. And then ultimately, I just wanted to mention this, something we were actually discussing before we actually recorded or started to record here today, is like this subtle shift, this pivot I'm trying to take the podcast in, which is, even though I started off by being very adamant about talking about the lyrics of Stephen Sondheim, I do think that sometimes gives short shrift to the music that he's writing as well. And as you mentioned at the very beginning here, like most of the critical analysis or even educational analysis and stuff that is out there really just focus on lyrics and lyric writing, and not a lot goes into like, let's talk actually about the musicianship and like what is actually happening within the music. Or very rarely does that happen. That's never happened. So yes, that's just me saying that it's nice to read something like this that is like really going deep into chordal structure, what is happening underneath the hood, so to speak, within the music, rather than just focusing on the lyrics.
Yeah, I think it's a really great start. I think there's just so much to dive into when it comes to Sondheim studies. I guess one thing I was thinking about as you were talking is I've been doing a lot of reading, especially this summer and this last semester, of just kind of catching myself up on the field of like music text relationships in any genre. But the idea of like, all these different parameters of poetry interacting with parameters of music. Matthew Bailey Shea has an awesome book called Lines and Their Lyrics, I want to say.
Yeah.
You're familiar with it? Great.
Someone else, a previous guest recommended this book to me, and I still have not read it. Sorry, I just actually looked it up here. It looks like it is called Lines and Lyrics.
Oh, it's really wonderful, and it's a great introduction. Like, it's a great introduction for poets who want to learn more about music, and it's a great introduction for musicians who want to learn more about poetry and those interactions. And so, yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot. And as I'm, reading this book, I think about some musical theater examples in Sondheim in the way that whether it's the syncopation of rhymes and where rhymes fall, and that creates syncopation in the melodic line. There's a lot that is in Sondheim because he's a prolific composer. There's just so much to dive into in so many parameters that we haven't even discussed. So like, for example, I haven't really necessarily seen like timbre in Sondheim as a big discussion. Now, of course, Tunick does a lot of his orchestrations. Like Sondheim doesn't necessarily have a lot of control over the timbre, but I mean, even things like the organ at the top of Sweeney, like that is a timbre that's piercing, and some other ideas there. And I think the timbre of dissonance, that we could talk about, or rhythm and meter, that's a whole field of music theory studies that I think if I were to do more like Sondheim specific, that would be the direction I kind of want to take it in, because I've been doing some stuff in that realm, and the idea of like how might the text impact the composer's choices of setting it, and how that impacts the audience's sense of the rhythm than the meter, changing meters or just like syncopations and stuff. And so yeah, there's a lot there, and I think what's important is that it doesn't matter if you have a master's or your PhD in music theory. Like if you're listening to these things and you can articulate how what matters is articulating in some sense like what you hear and what you're experiencing. And yeah, maybe there's certain vocabulary that is kind of standardized in the field that you could read up on later, but like, are you able to engage with this music from an analytical, inspirational way that and share it and show other people how you're hearing it? And I think, yeah, that'd be my encouragement. Like you do not need to have degrees in order to do music theory. Like just, you can check out this book, like take a look at it, read through some of these articles. Yeah, there's probably some terminology. I will say, I don't think we mentioned this. The book was kind of written with an audience of music theorists in mind. So there's terminology. Yeah, it is like, that's the target audience. But
I was joking with you before we started, and I still mean this. There's a part of the middle section where like, I have no idea what they're talking about right now, but it sounds cool. So yeah. I kept going on. But I think that there's some really great analysis around the deep like musicologist audience that this is geared towards.
Yeah.
And I look forward to your article next. Like now that you pitched this rhythm meter.
It's in the very early stages. That's all I'll say. As in, maybe it was an idea that I came up with yesterday.
It is a note on my phone currently. I want to end with basically the first sentence of the conclusion and the last sentence of the conclusion within this article, because I just think it's a great way of like summing it up. I guess it's the first two sentences of the conclusion here, but he states Sondheim is a musical theater category of his own, combining deep knowledge of 19th century classical tonality, Golden Age Broadway, and 20th century art music. He forged a new compositional language embracing avant-garde trends while remaining in dialogue with his tonal roots. And then ultimately he wraps up by saying, what is already clear is that Stephen Sondheim's tonal contributions place him as a groundbreaking historical figure, not only in musical theater, but in 20th century music writ large. So I think that's a great way to sum up the whole thing, is like, yes, he is known as like this like gigantic force within musical theater, but I think his contributions to music will have to see how history goes, but it feels like it's going to prove to be a contribution to just music in general.
100%. I know of, more and more classes in music schools are teaching, Sondheim in his examples in the music theory classroom, or full courses on Sondheim's music. It's becoming more and more common, and it's really exciting.
Micah, was there anything we didn't touch on that we think we should bring up?
I think this is good.
Thank you so much for doing this. This was a really great conversation. If people wanted to keep in touch with you, see what you're up to online, is there an easy way to do so?
Yeah, I would say the easiest would be my website, micahmooney.com. Easy to find. I pride myself with a unique enough name. I have great search engine optimization. So honestly, just Google me and my website should be the first thing that comes up. But there's links to like my YouTube stuff, compositions and such. Instagram, mmooney33 as well. I'm not super active there. But my website's the biggest thing, I'd say. Yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you.